A desperate cry pierces the storm-ravaged Texas-New Mexico borderlands of 1876, where the raging Rio Sangre threatens to swallow life itself. Margaret Hale, a widowed rancher hardened by loss, risks everything to save a wounded Comanche warrior and a helpless infant from the merciless current. Bound by survival, yet divided by blood-soaked histories, their fragile alliance sparks a journey of trust and betrayal that will redefine their hearts. Will they find redemption amidst the chaos, or will the desert claim their souls? Subscribe now to uncover their fate and share where you're joining us from. Can two enemies forge a bond to save an innocent life? Stay tuned to find out. The year was 1876, and the Texas-New Mexico borderlands stretched like a sun-scorched graveyard, where desert dust choked the air and jagged mountains clawed at the sky. The Rio Sangre, swollen from days of relentless rain, roared through the canyon like a beast unchained, its waters thick with red mud and broken branches. Margaret Hale, a widow carved lean by grief and hardship, stood on the sagging porch of her ramshackle ranch, squinting into the fading light. Her husband's death at the hands of Comanche raiders 3 years prior had left her alone, tethered to this unforgiving land by stubbornness and the ghost of a life once dreamed. A sound sliced through the storm's dying howl, a cry, sharp and raw, not animal, but human, desperate. Margaret's heart lurched. She grabbed her oilskin coat, the wind whipping her braid loose as she stumbled toward the riverbank. The Rio Sangre churned below, a blood-hued torrent that could swallow a man whole. There, in the fading gray of dusk, she saw it. A figure thrashing in the current, one arm locked around a leather basket, the other clawing at a half-submerged log. Inside the basket, a baby's wail pierced the air, frail yet fierce against the river's roar. Margaret didn't think. She plunged into the icy water, boots sinking into the muddy bank. The current yanked at her skirts, heavy as lead, but she fought forward, her hands seizing a tangle of roots to anchor herself. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair plastered to a face etched with pain. Blood seeped from gashes across his chest, staining the water crimson. A Comanche, she realized, her stomach twisting with old hatred. But the baby's cries drowned out her thoughts, and she lunged, grabbing the basket as the man's grip faltered. The river surged, pulling them under, and for a moment, the world was a cold, red blur. She kicked hard, her lungs burning, and broke the surface, dragging the basket to her chest. The man was heavier, his body limp, as she hooked an arm under his shoulder. With a strength born of desperation, she hauled them toward the bank, her boots slipping in the sludge. Branches snapped against her face, drawing blood. But she didn't stop until she collapsed on the rocky shore. The basket clutched tight, and the man sprawled beside her. The baby screamed, alive, its tiny fists flailing. The man didn't move, his breath shallow, his skin cold as the river itself. Margaret staggered to her feet, the weight of her sodden clothes dragging at her. The ranch was a half-mile off, a speck of weathered wood against the vast, unforgiving land. She slung the basket over her shoulder, the baby's cries now a steady rhythm, and looped the man's arm around her neck. He was heavy as a fallen steer, but she grit her teeth and started walking, the wind cutting through her like a blade. Each step was a battle against the mud and her own exhaustion, the horizon blurring with the threat of nightfall. The chink of lantern light glowed faintly as she reached the ranch. The cabin was little more than a lean-to, its walls patched with rawhide and hope. She kicked the door open, laying the man on a straw pallet by the hearth. The baby she set on her own cot, peeling back the basket's soaked leather to reveal a squalling infant, no more than a month old, wrapped in deerskin. Its dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Margaret's resolve wavered. She shook it off, stoking the fire until it crackled, casting shadows across the man's bloodied frame. She tore strips from an old petticoat, boiling water over the fire to clean his wounds. His chest rose and fell unevenly, gashes deep enough to show bone. A warrior, no doubt. His hands calloused, his face marked with the stoic lines of a man who'd seen death and dealt it. Margaret's fingers trembled as she worked, her mind flashing to her husband's final moments, cut down in a rage she'd blamed on men like this. Yet here she was, saving one. The baby's cries softened as she fed it a trickle of goat's milk from a rag, her hand steady despite the storm in her chest. The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Dark, sharp, and wary. He reached for a knife at his belt, but his hand fell weak. Margaret froze, her own hand inching toward the rifle propped against the wall. Their gazes locked. Two enemies bound by a fragile thread, the life of the child between them. Outside, the Rio Sangre roared on, indifferent to the fragile truce forming in the flicker of the firelight. The firelight flickered, painting the cabin's rough-hewn walls with shifting shadows that seemed to pulse with the tension between Margaret Hale and the Comanche warrior she'd dragged from the Rio Sangre's jaws. The year was 1876, and in the Texas-New Mexico borderlands, trust was a currency rarer than gold, spent only at great risk. Margaret sat by the hearth, the infant she'd named Little Star cradled in her arms, her rifle within reach. The warrior, Chief Natoka, as she'd later learn, lay on the straw pallet, his dark eyes now open, tracking her every move like a hawk sizing up prey. Natoka's hand rested near the bone-handled knife at his belt, his fingers twitching as if itching to draw it. His wounds, though cleaned and bound, wept blood through the strips of petticoat Margaret had sacrificed. She'd seen eyes like his before, hard, unyielding, forged in a crucible of loss. They were the eyes of a man who'd watched his world burn at the hands of settlers like her kin. Margaret's own gaze was no softer. The memory of her husband's blood-soaked body, cut down by Comanche raiders, lingered like a bruise on her soul. Yet here they were, tethered by the fragile cries of the child. She rocked gently, its warmth a fleeting anchor in the storm of their mutual distrust. The cabin creaked under the wind's relentless assault, the desert night clawing at the walls. Margaret set Little Star in a makeshift cradle of blankets, her hand steady but her heart racing. She offered Natoka a tin cup of broth, the steam curling like a ghost in the chill air. He stared at it, his jaw tight, and pushed it away with a slow, deliberate motion. The rejection stung, but Margaret understood. To him, her food was poison, her kindness a trap. She turned away, busying herself with the fire, but kept the rifle stock in her peripheral vision. Trust was a luxury neither could afford. The first night passed in a taut silence, broken only by the pop of burning mesquite and Little Star's soft whimpers. Natoka lay still, his breathing uneven, but his eyes never left Margaret. She slept in fits, one hand on the rifle, the other near a skinning knife tucked under her cot. Dawn broke gray and cold, the sun a pale disk behind a shroud of clouds. Margaret rose, her bones aching from the river's toll, and checked the child. Little Star's tiny hand gripped her finger, a small act that softened the edges of her fear. Natoka stirred, propping himself up despite the pain that carved lines deeper into his face. He spoke no English, but his gestures were clear. He wanted water. Margaret hesitated, then fetched a gourd from the barrel by the door, setting it just within his reach. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, as if measuring her intent. She met his gaze, her own defiance a mirror to his. "You're alive," she said, her voice low. but don't think I trust you." The words hung heavy, unanswered, but the slight narrowing of his eyes told her he understood more than he let on. The day dragged on, each task a delicate dance around the other. Margaret milked the lone goat, her hands trembling as she felt Nachtoka's stare from the cabin's open door. He watched her haul wood, his silence louder than any threat. When Little Star wailed, both moved instinctively, Margaret to soothe, Nachtoka to check the child's wrappings. Their hands brushed briefly, and both recoiled, the air crackling with unspoken accusations. Yet the child's needs forced them into a grudging rhythm. Margaret boiled water. Nachtoka stoked the fire with his good arm, each movement watched by the other, like rival gunslingers in a standoff. Outside, the borderlands whispered of danger. Hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond the cabin, a world of bounty hunters and militias who'd see Nachtoka's presence as treason. Margaret knew the rumors would spread, her name already tainted in the eyes of the settlement for living alone, defying the role of a proper widow. Nachtoka, too, seemed to sense the closing net. He tested his strength, standing briefly before collapsing back, his face a mask of frustration. Margaret caught a flicker of something else in his eyes, grief, perhaps, for a life left behind in the river's mud. By nightfall, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of their shared history. Margaret sat by Little Star, humming a half-forgotten hymn to calm the child. Nachtoka watched, his knife now sheathed, but still close. The fire's glow caught the scars on his hands, each one a story of survival. Margaret's own hands bore calluses from years of toil, her wedding band long sold for seed that never took root. In that moment, they were not enemies, but two souls caught in the borderland's cruel grip, bound by a child who knew nothing of their hatred. The night stretched on, and with it, the first cracks in their armor began to show. The scars on their hands told stories of survival, but it was the child's innocent grip that began to unravel the knot of enmity between them. Margaret Hale and Chief Nachtoka found themselves bound by necessity in the cramped cabin. The fire's glow softened the night's chill, and Little Star's steady breathing became the only sound, louder than the creak of the weathered walls. Outside, the horizon lay heavy with the threat of hoofbeats, but within, a fragile truce was taking root, sown by the demands of a life too small to know their hatred. Margaret knelt by the cradle, her fingers tracing the edge of the deerskin wrapping Little Star. The child's dark eyes, wide and searching, held no judgment, only need. She mixed a thin gruel from crushed corn, her hands moving with the muscle memory of a woman who'd once hoped for a family. Nachtoka watched from the pallet, his wounds forcing him to lean against the wall, his face a mask of guarded pain. He'd begun to move more, testing his strength, but each step was a grimace etched in firelight. When Little Star fussed, he reached out, adjusting the blanket with a gentleness that caught Margaret off guard. Their eyes met briefly, not with trust, but with a shared understanding. The child's survival demanded they set aside their knives, if only for a moment. The days blurred into a rhythm of necessity. Margaret hauled water from the nearby spring, her boots crunching on the brittle earth, while Nachtoka, still weak, split kindling with a hatchet, his movements precise despite the pain. The cabin smelled of smoke and goat's milk, the air thick with unspoken questions. Margaret caught herself humming a hymn her mother once sang, the notes slipping out as she stirred a pot of beans. Nachtoka's gaze softened then, and he murmured something in his own tongue, low and rhythmic, like a prayer to the stars. It was the first crack in the wall between them, a glimpse of lives lived before blood and loss defined them. Memories crept in like shadows at dusk. Margaret's mind drifted to her husband, his voice rough but kind, saying, "Not every Indian's your enemy, Maggie. Some fight for the same things we do. Home, kin, a place to stand. She'd dismissed it then, her grief too raw. But now, watching Natoka cradle little Star to quiet its cries, she wondered. Natoka, too, was haunted. In the flicker of the fire, he saw his mother's face, her words clear as the desert sky. Even among foes, there are hearts that beat true. He looked at Margaret, her hands worn from toil, and saw not the enemy, but a woman fighting to keep the world from breaking her. The child's needs wove them closer. When little Star's fever spiked, Margaret boiled sage leaves, her brow furrowed with worry. Natoka, recognizing the herb, nodded approval, his fingers brushing hers as he took the cloth to cool the baby's forehead. The touch was brief, electric with caution, but it held a weight neither could name. They worked in tandem, their movements synchronized by the child's fragile breaths. It was then Margaret spoke, her voice low but steady. "This little one's all we've got to keep us human out here. If you're enjoying this tale of unlikely allies in a brutal land, consider subscribing to hear more stories like theirs. Share where you're listening from. It'd mean the world to know." Her words hung in the air, a quiet bridge to the world beyond the cabin. Outside, the borderlands grew restless. A hawk's cry cut through the dawn, and Margaret spotted tracks near the spring. Boots, not hooves, too close for comfort. Natoka noticed her tension, his hand tightening on the hatchet. He pointed to the horizon, where dust clouds hinted at riders. "They come for me," he said, his English halting but clear, the first words he'd spoken to her. Margaret's heart sank, not from fear, but from the weight of what his presence meant. The settlement already whispered of her as a traitor for living alone. Harboring a Comanche would brand her an outcast. Yet as she looked at little Star, sleeping soundly for the first time in days, she felt a resolve harden within her. Night fell, and the cabin's walls seemed to shrink, the air thick with the scent of sage and unspoken truths. Margaret cleaned her rifle, her movements deliberate, while Natoka sharpened his knife, the scrape of stone on blade a steady counterpoint to the fire's crackle. They were still enemies, their pasts a chasm too wide to cross, but little Star's presence was a tether, pulling them toward a shared purpose. The desert night stretched vast and merciless, but within the cabin, a fragile hope flickered, born of necessity and the first stirrings of understanding. Margaret woke to the distant howl of a coyote, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle beside her cot. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting a faint red haze over Natoka, who sat upright, his knife gleaming as he sharpened it against a whetstone. His wounds, though healing, forced a grimace with each motion, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin's single window. The tracks Margaret had spotted near the spring, boots, not hooves, gnawed at her thoughts. Someone was watching, and the borderlands were no place for secrets. By midday, the air hung heavy with the promise of trouble. Margaret stepped outside to check the goat pen, her boots kicking up clouds of parched earth. The horizon shimmered, but a faint plume of dust betrayed riders in the distance, their shapes too deliberate to be passing travelers. She tightened her grip on the water bucket, her pulse quickening. Natoka emerged from the cabin, his steps steadier now, the hatchet tucked into his belt. He followed her gaze, his jaw set like granite. "Hunters," he said, his English rough but certain. "They want my head." Margaret nodded, her throat dry. The bounty on a Comanche chief was worth more than her ranch, and the settlement's whispers branded her a traitor for sheltering him. Inside, they fortified their fragile sanctuary. Margaret dragged a heavy table to block the door, its warped wood groaning under the strain. Natoka, using a broken chair leg as a crutch, checked the cabin's walls for weak spots, his movements precise, despite the pain etching lines across his face. Little Star slept fitfully in the cradle, unaware of the storm brewing beyond the cabin's thin defenses. Margaret caught Natoka's eye as she loaded her rifle, the weight of their shared burden unspoken but heavy. "They'll come for me too," she said, her voice low, "for keeping you here." Natoka's gaze flickered, not with trust, but with a grudging respect for her defiance. The rumors had spread faster than wildfire. Margaret's solitary life had already made her a pariah in the settlement, a widow who refused to remarry or bend to their rules. Now, word of her harboring a Comanche chief had reached the ears of the militia, a ragtag band of settlers and soldiers itching for blood and bounty. She overheard snippets from a passing trader the day before. "Hale's gone soft, hiding a savage." The words cut deeper than she'd admit, but she pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand, keeping Little Star alive and the cabin secure. Natoka, sensing the noose tightening, spoke of his people for the first time. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder over the mountains, as he described the raids that had cost him brothers, the treaties broken by men with ink-stained hands. "Your kind took our rivers," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire. Margaret bristled, but held her tongue, her own losses too raw to argue. Instead, she shared a truth of her own. "My husband died fighting your kin, but he said you weren't all monsters." The admission hung between them, a fragile thread stretched across a chasm of pain. They worked through the afternoon, reinforcing the cabin with what little they had. Margaret nailed boards over the window, leaving only a sliver to watch the horizon. Natoka fashioned a spear from a broken fence post, his hand steady despite the fever that lingered in his wounds. When Little Star cried, they took turns soothing her, their movements a practiced dance born of necessity. The child's presence was a shield, keeping their anger at bay, but the outside world cared nothing for such bonds. As dusk fell, the air grew thick with the scent of sagebrush and impending rain. Margaret spotted a glint of metal on the ridge, a rifle barrel catching the last light. Her stomach knotted. The militia was closing in, their greed and fear a more immediate threat than the desert's harsh embrace. Natoka stood beside her, his silhouette tall against the fading sun. "We fight, or we die," he said, his voice steady as the stone beneath their feet. Margaret nodded, her hand tightening on the rifle. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a fortress, and the storm gathering beyond its walls would test more than their resolve. It would test the fragile thread binding them to Little Star and to each other. The militia's approach was no longer a whisper, but a roar, their torches cutting through the night like vengeful stars. The desert air crackled with the scent of sagebrush and gunpowder, and as the wind howled, it carried the promise of blood. Margaret gripped her rifle, her knuckles white as she peered through the boarded window's narrow slit. The militia, 24 men, their faces twisted with greed and righteous fury, formed a half-circle around the cabin. Their leader, Captain Harrow, a barrel-chested man with a scar splitting his brow, bellowed her name. "Margaret Hale, hand over the savage and his spawn, or we burn this traitor's den to ash." His voice was a blade, sharp with accusation, but Margaret's resolve was iron. She glanced at Natoka, his spear clutched tight, his eyes burning with a defiance that matched her own. Inside, Little Star whimpered, stirring in her cradle. Margaret's heart clenched, but she stood firm, stepping to the door and flinging it open. The torchlight bathed her in an orange glow, her silhouette stark against the cabin's dark interior. "He's a man, not a trophy," she shouted, her voice cutting through the wind. "This child's no prize for your bounties." The militia jeered, their rifles glinting, but Natoka stepped forward, placing little Star gently in Margaret's arms. He faced the mob, his stance unyielding, ready to meet death on his terms. The air grew thick, the moment teetering on the edge of violence. A bounty hunter, his face half hidden by a tattered hat, pushed through the crowd, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Harrow's got no claim to honor," he spat, his words reckless. "He sold guns to the Comanche, got their kin slaughtered for profit." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The militia faltered, their eyes darting to Harrow, whose face drained of color. Natoka's gaze sharpened, his memory flashing to brothers lost in raids fueled by betrayal. Margaret's breath caught. She'd heard rumors of corruption, but never this truth, raw and damning. Chaos erupted. A militiaman lunged at the bounty hunter, fists flying, while others turned on Harrow, their shouts drowning out the wind. Margaret seized the moment, slamming the door shut and barring it with the table. Natoka grabbed his spear, his movement swift despite his wounds. A shot rang out, splintering the door's edge, and Margaret returned fire, her rifle's kick jarring her shoulder. Natoka hurled a chair through the window, shattering the boards, and thrust his spear at a shadow that ventured too close. The cabin became a battlefield, its walls shuddering under the assault. Together, they fought, their movements a desperate symphony. Margaret reloaded, her hand steady despite the chaos, while Natoka guarded the door, his spear a blur of precision. Little Star's cries pierced the din, urging them on. A torch sailed through the broken window, igniting a blanket, but Margaret smothered it with a bucket of water, her lungs burning from smoke. The militia's unity crumbled, Harrow's betrayal sowing doubt. Some fled, their curses lost in the storm, while others pressed the attack, driven by greed. But Margaret and Natoka held firm, their shared purpose a shield against the onslaught. As the first light of dawn broke, the militia retreated, their numbers thinned, their resolve broken. The cabin stood scarred, but unbowed, the ground outside littered with spent shells and bloodstains. Margaret sank to the floor, her rifle clattering beside her, exhaustion carving lines into her face. Natoka knelt by Little Star, his fingers brushing the child's cheek, his eyes heavy with the weight of survival. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time, no hatred lingered in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement of their shared fight. Margaret lifted Little Star, her arms trembling, and handed her to Natoka. "She's yours," she said, her voice rough but steady. He nodded, cradling the child, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. The desert stretched vast before them, its beauty cruel but enduring. Natoka turned toward the mountains, his step slow but certain, Little Star nestled against his chest. Margaret watched from the porch, her body aching, her heart alight with a truth hard-won. In a land warped by vengeance, they'd found a fleeting justice, not in blood, but in the choice to protect a life. The Rio Sangre murmured in the distance, its waters quieter now, as if bearing witness to the humanity they'd salvaged from the borderland's unforgiving heart. Margaret Hale and Chief Natoka's journey from enmity to uneasy alliance speaks to the power of shared humanity in a land scarred by vengeance. What did their story stir in you? Did their courage or the fragile hope they found resonate? Please share your thoughts and where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your reflections. My gratitude goes to you for joining this journey through the unforgiving desert. Until our next tale, may you find your own spark of justice in the wilds of life. Farewell for now.